Coming live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Trouble Begins. As always, my name is Jody O'Brien, and I'm the Director of Collections at the Mark Twain House Museum. I will be your host for this evening, and thank everybody for being here. We have a good 109 people registered for tonight, so that's really awesome. Before we get going, I want to do a couple administrative announcements that many of you have probably heard many of times now. As a lot of you have found, there is a chat feature on the right side of your screen. Go ahead and talk amongst yourself, leave us comments there. I'll be monitoring it throughout. But if you have a question for our guest, Katie, tonight, there is an Ask a Question feature down at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and plug your questions in there. And then at the end of the evening, that's where I'll pull from during our Q&A section. Also, next to that Ask a Question feature, there is a green box that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House Museum. Please donate here. Every dollar, $1, $5, $10, $100, whatever you are able to give, we are very appreciative of it. It keeps programs like this going. It keeps our research library open to scholars, keeps the doors open, all of our tours, all of those things. So it's not required, but definitely welcomed. The last thing I want to say before I introduce our guest is a big thank you to the Center for Mark Twain Studies at Elmira College in New York. They're the ones that support and sponsor this Trouble Begins program series, and we wouldn't be here without them. So thank you to everybody there. So my guest tonight is Katie Mears. She is a writer. She's a comedy journalist. She has a podcast. She's helped written a book on stand-up comedy. And the reason she's here tonight is because she actually wrote her thesis paper on Mark Twain and stand-up comedy. So welcome, Katie. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi. Oh my gosh, what a blast. Yeah, happy to be here and happy to be chatting with you.
Great. So we're going to get going. And first question. Why Mark Twain and stand-up? Where did this thesis come from?
Sure, yeah. So I was writing about stand-up long before I knew much of anything about Mark Twain. I'd read a few of his books in school, like all of us probably have, but didn't really know much about him as a lecturer. And I remember, reading all these books about comedy history and reading about stand-up, and a lot of them had very strong opinions on where stand-up comes from. It's a strange art form. It's sort of hard to define. You can trace some of it back to things like burlesque and minstrelsy. You can trace a lot of it back to vaudeville. But I also am a firm believer that a lot of it also just comes from people doing lectures, people making jokes on a stage from a more literary perspective. And so, I would read these different books and I'd be like, I think we can continue to trace back even further, though. There were people before vaudeville that were doing these things. What about the people in the 19th century? What were they doing on a stage? And also, just to be frank with you, the other part of it, I was in grad school and I was looking to write about stand-up for my thesis and trying to find a good angle. And I remember thinking, my professors are incredibly smart. They're incredibly decorated. They know so much about so much. And I wasn't really sure that they would be that interested in stand-up. I thought maybe this is a little lowbrow. And Mark Twain sort of became a Trojan horse for me to make people think critically about stand-up. Of like, oh, okay, maybe if this is something that Mark Twain has to deal with, okay, maybe something is going on. Maybe this is a little bit more, deep. Maybe there's a little more happening here than just kind of like some vulgar lower art form. So that's where a lot of it comes from. And the more I read about Mark Twain, the more I read his notes and his letters and reviews of his lectures, and the better image I had in my head of what he was doing on stage, the more it became clear to me of like, oh, this feels like stand-up. This feels a lot like what we call stand-up today. And so it was really fun to dive into, okay, what did he do that was different than his contemporaries? What did he do that was similar? Who did he learn from? And what are those X factors that make something feel like stand-up as opposed to a funny lecture or something like that?
Yeah. So you just mentioned some of the people he learned from, and in your thesis, and as we've been chatting, and as many of us know, Artemus Ward was one of his good friends and contemporaries and everything. And so I know in your thesis, some people trace it back to him. Mm-hmm. What made Mark Twain a little bit different than Artemus Ward, in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's really hard to say anything about Mark Twain without someone being like, But Artemis Ward did it first. There's definitely the Artemis Ward lovers out there. And frankly, Artemis Ward died pretty young. So you can play the what if game of like, oh, if he had lived a bit longer, if he had been a little bit more prolific, would he be more remembered as the great humorist that he was? There is that question. Of course, Mark Twain lived a lot longer. Mark Twain was more famous in other realms. So that's a bit of why he has such a legacy. But Mark Twain met Artemis Ward. They became really dear friends. You can read the letters between them, the correspondences. They're just like, they think each other are really spectacular. But Artemis Ward was a performer who would speak in a very casual way. He spoke in a way that felt very different than the kind of booming melodramatic trends of that era. And so, they loved this. They had this kind of draw together. Yes, John Pascal is really wonderful. I've actually interviewed him. He's a great Artemis Ward scholar, knows a lot more than me about Ward. So check him out if you want to learn more about Artemis Ward. Artemis Ward was still sort of doing a character. There are some scholars who disagree on this, but it's believed that he was doing an impression of like a P.T. Barnum type, this kind of like Yankee showman persona, where Mark Twain was just doing more a version of himself. Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, where Mark Twain wasn't like a specific persona that he put on, it was often just kind of an extension of himself. And so, he learned a ton from him. I'm not sure we would have had Mark Twain in the same way if it weren't for Artemis Ward. He kind of taught Twain that like, oh yeah, it doesn't have to be as formal. It can be casual. It can feel like we're sitting on your front porch. It can feel sort of extemporaneous. And those are things that are really central to stand-up, and that those are things that made Twain really pop, is learning that informality, that kind of, casual Mississippi thing, Mississippi River, Missouri thing that we love about him so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a little bit more about his stage presence, because I know that was one of the huge things in your thesis. And one of the things that in your thesis I know you don't have your own kind of definition of stand-up comedy. There isn't really like a clear-cut one out there, right? There's many, and everybody kind of defines it differently. Yeah. And, let's not box it in. But one of the things is, stand-up versus just out there just telling jokes, right? There's a different persona, but it's not kitschy and all of that. So
it can be kitschy for sure.
It can be kitschy, but it's not the heavily makeup or the heavy.
No props, no costumes typically. Yeah. It's fascinating. A lot of people have tried to define stand-up, and some have more strict definitions than others. It's kind of interesting. If you're looking at different comedy scholars, you can learn a lot about what they think stand-up is based on not only their definition, but based on who they think the first stand-up was, right? So, if they're more pointing towards someone who sang and danced on stage, they might have a more physical perspective on what stand-up is, where if you prefer thinking about the origins of stand-up in the Artemis Ward, Mark Twain camp, you probably have a more literary perspective. You're probably more tuned into what a stand-up comedian says on stage. For example, a comedian like Mike Birbiglia nowadays probably has more in line with Twain and Will Rogers and Mort Saul and comedians who put the words first than someone, like a Jim Carrey type, someone in the 80s who was much more bound to their physicality. So yes, Twain's stage presence was very singular, very captivating. There's lots of contemporary reviews about how people watched him like a cat to a mouse. They were very entranced. And one of the things that he was going for that I think made him really last is he wanted people to feel like they knew him. He wanted to feel conversational. He wanted to feel approachable. And this kind of blurring of his stage persona and of his private life was a lot of why people loved him. A big problem, I guess you don't have to see it as a problem, but a big thing that happens a lot with stand-up comedians is this kind of parasocial tendency where you feel like you know this person. And that's happening more and more as there are more art forms that are just really conducive to that. Like if you're a YouTuber, or if you're a podcaster, or if you're in an art form that has fewer gatekeepers between you and your audience, you're more likely to have that kind of parasocial thing. But yeah, he really wanted it to seem casual, and he did a great job in speaking in this very slow, very rambly. I'm sure people are very familiar with the Hal Holbrook version, and how Hal performed as Mark Twain longer than Sam Clemens did,
Right.
which I remember just being gobsmacked by. I think it was like 63 or 64 years that he did it. Oh my gosh, we have an uninvited guest. Hello. It's perfect that you have a cat.
Earlier, so.
Yeah, well, cats come up all the time with Twain because he loved cats so much. They always had a ton in the house. You know, when you're learning about him as a comedian, and it's funny that we were just talking about Parasocial, because I definitely have read so many of his letters that I feel like I know him, but you never truly know these people. But
well, I also think it's interesting that like so many people, right, that the Mark Twain, Sam Clemens is so intertwined, and I know at the Mark Twain House, like whenever I'm writing about him or thinking about him, it's like, do I use Twain, do I use Clemens, do I use Mark,
sure.
You know, how do I refer to him? And we're so engulfed in his writing that his lectures are something, again, separate from that, and they all kind of morph together. And
sure,
Mark Twain versus Sam, who was on stage, really, you know.
Sure. And it was fascinating. I remember reading some of his letters and seeing people refer to him as Mark in his letters, and I was like, oh, so okay, some of these people didn't even call him Sam. How does he introduce himself? How does he think of himself? There is this real blurring, and you know, a lot of work has been done in terms of his brand. In the later years of his life, he would only allow people to photograph him in the white suit. Like, he was very aware of how he was coming across, and that was very important to him. If you just looked at a list of all of the different biographies that have been written about him, you'll see that binary come up all the time. You know, there'll be like Sam Clemens, The Adventures of Mark Twain, or the singular Mark Twain. People, you know, it's a very common thing of trying to be able to parse this one man with these different identities. But you know, it's fascinating, and it's also fascinating how his comedy is such a central part of, you know, we think of him as this great American humorist. The Mark Twain Award is something that are given to comedians, not given to novelists, for example. Like, it's a huge part of his legacy, and yet so many people don't know about his lectures, and his novels often come first in our memory. So yeah, he walks this fine line. I think you know, I've had a lot of debates with Twain scholars about how much he actually enjoyed being a lecturer or not, because, you know, it's there is this sense that he didn't really like it. And there's a lot of letters where he talks about hating it. But there's a couple of factors involved in that, because, you know, maybe he missed his wife, maybe he didn't like being on tour, maybe he was having a bad run. But then you also read some of these letters where he had a great show and he's like, I wanted to talk for a week straight. I had a blast. I loved it. So yeah, he's kind of fickle in that way. Yeah. I think he definitely wanted to be remembered as a little more highbrow. He saw himself as this sort of man of letters, and being a humorist back then obviously didn't have the clout or the respect that it does now. So I often wonder, you know, if he had been around today and if he had done that act, would he have allowed himself to enjoy performing more, because it didn't also carry this kind of, you know, for lack of a better word, humiliation factor, because he felt like it was beneath him sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, no, I think it's also important to point out, right? Like, he always went back to lecturing every time he needed money, right? That was when you know.
Yeah, the money is a big part of the story. Money is a huge part of the story. Yeah.
You know, every time he made a bad investment on that dang page compositor, right? Or something else, he needed to go back to the lectures rather than writing. So it was definitely an integral part of his life. And I think the two things, at least in my opinion, one of the things that for me sways me to the camp of he had to enjoy some of it, was that he kind of did it at home too, right? Like, one of the things we talked about is that he did this improvisational storytelling for his girls, where he used the mantelpiece and all of that, and he basically did little lectures for them. So he liked that performance. And is it a letter to Jean that he's just like, I like the petting from it?
Sure.
Attention, right?
I can stand considerable petting, he once wrote in a letter of like, yeah, he liked being praised and he didn't have much problem with that. If anyone's unfamiliar with what we're talking about, he, and please correct me if I don't get the details right, but on their mantelpiece when his girls were young, they had a few, different items along the mantle. I think one was like a portrait of a cat. There were a few, little like kind of kitschy things that they had. And he would play this game with his daughters where every night he would look at those elements, those items, and tell a story that somehow would involve all of those items. So, at some point in that story, there's going to be a cat, for example. He loved cats. Cats keep coming up tonight. But it was a way to, I think, really sharpen his improvisational skills, to practice speaking in this kind of flow element. And one of the things that I think is really central, we laugh about how stand-up is hard to define, but one of the things that I think really separates stand-up from other oratory forms is how much listening is involved. And what I mean by that is a stand-up comedian, there's always going to be counterexamples, but typically a stand-up comedian is really listening to their audience and thus changing their act accordingly when it comes to how the audience is responding. So, if the audience is laughing more at dirty jokes, you're going to lean into that. You're probably going to tell more dirty jokes. If the audience is getting a little rowdy, you might need to stop a little bit, do some crowd work, get their attention back, and then proceed, as opposed to someone just speaking for a really long time. And someone who could tell these improvised stories every night is someone that I believe would be incredibly good at that. Being able to not only go off book when needed, but to be keyed into your audience in that way. Yeah. And we see time and time again in his letters this ability of, actually, there's one in particular where he talks about how he wished that his lectures were like a big block of wood, and every 6 inches there was a hole into which he could insert either something serious or something comical, and like build his lecture that way, depending on the temperament of the audience. So that's something that I think is a really key element in how we think about stand-up and how we think about Mark Twain as an influence on that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess the other point that I was going to make about the lecture series and liking it is, whether the intent was there or not, it's kind of a full circle, right? He traveled on these lecture tours, gave him elements for his comedy, but then it also gave him fodder for all of his novels, right?
Yeah, sure.
So much of the things that we, read came from these trips and the people who he interacted with and things like that, and it helped, bridge his content. So like you were saying, not only did it make his audience were diverse, he could then use those things. So sure. Yeah. It's amazing.
He would read passages from his books on stage to try and sell those books, and then talk about his adventures on the road into more books. He was really good at self-promotion. He was really good at branding. And as we all know, he never missed out on a payday. So he was right. Money's a big part of the story.
Yeah. And as such, he kind of became, I know you mentioned it in your thesis, and we've heard it everywhere. He kind of became kind of like the first celebrity in a sense, right? Like so many people knew him, and not only just because, he was everywhere. He was in your home where you could read him. He was on the stage. He traveled to all these different places, and he did cater to all levels of society in ways. So he wasn't so niche and
universal appeal, almost like literally. Planetary appeal. Yeah, he went on a world tour performing, what we would call stand-up in the 1890s, long before anyone was doing that. I think it was maybe like one sports team, and I think Tom Thumb are the two examples of pre-Twain circumnavigation entertainment. But Twain is obviously different from those because it's someone who people are going to spend time with them. People are going to hear their thoughts. And the fact that Twain was able to sell out houses in India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, like the level of fame you have to be an international celebrity, pre-internet, pre-everything. It's just a remarkable level of fame. Yeah. It's hard to even fathom.
Yeah. Yeah, I know we had a visitor come to the archives a few weeks ago, and we pulled out the salesman prospectus for, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, and it's, people would go door to door selling his books, and in some ways he kind of did the same just with his lecture series.
Yeah. Just quickly, I see that some people in the chat are talking about John Mulaney, and John Mulaney is like a really interesting part of this kind of whole conversation. Actually, I happened to see him a week ago. If you're not familiar, he's this modern day stand-up comedian who had a really rough year. He went into rehab, he got a divorce, and now he's kind of trying to reinvent himself. And a lot of his fan base is feeling a little bit lost or confused because of what we were talking about earlier, because of this kind of parasocial relationship. They thought they knew him, and then when it finds out that this comedian who he thought was this kind of like sweet, mild guy was like a raging drug addict, then you have to kind of reframe yourself. And it was fascinating to see him now it feels like seeing the real John Mulaney after all of these years. And it's going to be interesting to watch how he goes about rebuilding his reputation, how he goes about reframing himself with now all of this new information that people have. And the question sort of, like when Twain's reputation was in the dumpster, when he had, there were headlines, Mark Twain failure, Mark Twain in tremendous debt. Will he be able to reform his relationship with his audience in the way that Twain was able to? Twain paid off all his debts. He came back from his world tour. He had like a big hero's welcome. So yeah, John Mulaney is an interesting parallel in a lot of ways to what we're talking about.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Good questions, Dale and Fabian. So I want to bring it back a little bit to this kind of definition of stand-up. And one of the things that you referenced is Twain's How to Tell a Story. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, and comedic versus humorist and British American?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm not quite sure that I totally believe the strange like ethnic underpinnings of that short story. But in the 1900s, Twain wrote just this like little piece called How to Tell a Story. And it's about the difference between telling something that is funny because of the way in which you're saying it, and telling something in a way that's funny based on what it is. So the manner versus the matter. And what he wrote and what he very much believes is that anyone can tell a joke that has like a stand-up, a joke that has a standard, setup and punchline. That is something that's funny because it's funny, because the subject matter is funny. But telling something that isn't necessarily funny and making it funny because of the way in which you're saying it, that's something that he sees as very separate. That's something that he sees as something that takes a tremendous amount of skill. It's what I would call stand-up, and I think had the word existed, he would have called it stand-up as well. But yeah, he does a really great job explaining the difference. His whole idea is that, a joke bursts at the end where the story and the stand-up kind of burbles along. And, a stand-up comedian is often telling jokes, but I would say even more often than that, embedding their jokes into stories in ways that sneak up on you, but in ways that burble along and keep you listening, as opposed to just waiting to hear a punchline and then tuning back out again, Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely, and I just put in the Gutenberg.org link to the How to Tell a Story, so everybody else can read it.
Give that a read. It's interesting.
It is, and the humorous versus comedic, and I can totally see that because, I don't know, I think I'm funny, but nobody else does. So I would never be humorous. I'm just, that kind of thing, because have you, but
well, it's easy to imagine like a child telling a joke. It's harder to imagine a child doing like a stand-up bit. Like it's a very different thing.
Right. And he wasn't just dad jokes, and he wasn't just, what have you. It had this whole thing.
Sure.
And one of the other things, with that is, and kind of going back a little bit to his stage presence, he wouldn't just stand there, Miss Maisel version, right? Up at the microphone, was a microphone kind of thing, talking to the audience, going for the laughs. He kind of rambled and kind of stayed in corners and kind of got lost in the story himself a little bit, right?
Yeah, there's one story that I read about where he, he's kind of rambling along, and at one point he is very much in his own head and gets lost and has to ask the audience, like, what was I talking about? Like, that's how casual.
Like whatever lie you were just telling or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
They were like, a better question is to remind you of what lie you were in the middle of, which I think is funny. Yeah. It's a very Twain thing. Never let the truth get in the way of a good lie.
Right.
Yeah, he's a performer and he knows it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Is there a favorite lecture or letter or anything like that came up when you were researching this that like really helped solidify your belief in what he was kind of creating himself to be, or whether it was his brand or his on-site persona before he was branding himself, or on-stage persona before he was branding himself?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of things, obviously, and it's just so fun to explore what he was talking about and to learn kind of from a modern audience. Okay, this really holds up. This doesn't quite hold up. This is that. One of the things that I remember finding most interesting in the way in which he wanted to present himself was how how much he did not like when lecturers held books on stage, and how that was like a real sticking point for him. I read one of his letters where he was talking about a different lecturer, someone who performed under the name Petroleum V. Nasby, which is a fantastic stage name. But yeah, he was a contemporary of Twain, and Twain would write about how he would hold his notes on stage and read from them, and how his lectures, I think he used the word like devoid of art, like he had no time for that, no interest in that type of performance. And so it was really imperative for him that he had his stuff memorized, that he knew what he was doing. He typically told stories that were between 7 and 15 minutes long, making up about a 90-minute show on average, at least towards his later years. And it really mattered to him that he knew those stories. Now, of course, like we've mentioned, he would slot ones in depending on how the show was going and depending on, where he was and what made sense. He would often write material for that specific audience. When he was in Australia, he wrote this like poem about Australian animals and specifically the platypus. So he paid attention to his audience, but his real sticking point against reading, I think, is very critical and helps us to understand him as a stand-up more than as what I would call, a lecturer.
Right. Well, I think the sticking point on reading too, right? Like he would practice, obviously, lectures. You have to have some sort of base to go on, but he didn't want to be reading a script. It was, he would practice to the point where he knew where he was going, but not to the point where he couldn't get lost in his own rambling and
right.
what have you.
Right. Well, and he wanted it to have that ease, that conversationality. He wanted that. And if you're just watching someone read, that's going to be incredibly difficult to come across. I don't think that would ever work.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I know in one of his lectures, he was booked for multiple days in a row. And he wanted, he had to change it up every single time just in case his audience changed. And then they booked it for a fourth night and he had come up with a fourth one, automatically.
Yeah, exactly. He loved money, as we all know. Had a terrible relationship with it. But oftentimes when he was on the road, he wanted to allow for people to come to as many shows and not see the same stuff. So preparing multiple 90-minute shows, it's a tremendous amount of effort, especially for when he went on that world tour, he was in his 60s. So tremendous amount of effort. And a real artistic integrity.
I do well, like, okay, this is, practice for the one thing and then gone. But to have that much information like in your mind and to be part of it, he was really a true genius on so many matters. Like
definitely. Sure, of course.
Yeah.
Although I will say, remember when we're talking about this quantity of material, remember how incredibly slowly he spoke. So it's not as if he's writing, as much material as another person might to fill 90 minutes, talking incredibly slowly on stage.
That's true. And that was again part of his stage appeal, right? Like one of the things that he was known for was his drawling voice and his hesitancies, and we can all think of people from Missouri and the accent. And, we think of Hal Holbrook, right? We've already mentioned that a little bit, that Hal played Twain longer than Sam did, but
so strange.
His voice was part of that, and I'm sure he used that to his advantage.
Sure. Yeah, he knew how to pause.
With the occasional puff of a cigar. So, I
was actually reading about his cigar habit the other day, because I think he would smoke an insane amount. I think he smoked like 20 cigars a day. And there's a story of when he tried to quit at one point, and he told himself that he would only smoke one cigar a day. And slowly the cigar just got bigger and bigger and bigger, because he just, famously didn't have a ton of self-control, nor a ton of patience as a man. And so it's very comical to imagine him with this giant cigar before he just bagged it and went back to smoking as much as he pleased. Yeah.
I love all of the stories about him trying to become like a better man for Livy, and, stop drinking, stop smoking, stop swearing. And then he oh, damn it. No, just kidding. All within like a sentence. Then,
I know. Yeah, it's so funny that he loves this idea of him being this kind of like backwoods rapscallion kind of Huck Finn type. And then he marries this heiress who's always like yelling at him to stay in line. I mean, they love their letters. They're so in love. It's really charming. But it's funny to imagine him just, trying really hard to be his best for her, and often falling a little bit short of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, that dichotomy, again, he's such a man of two faces, but, it's part of his appeal, right? He has all these connections to all these when he married Livy and all of, his lecture tours, he's upper middle, upper class, upper middle class.
Right.
Yet he did come from, backwoods and a working man and all of those things. And so he was able to bridge. And I think that's one of the things that the audiences then loved about him and what we love about him today, right? I feel like everybody you encounter, no matter where they are in the world or whatever spectrum they're on, everybody has something about Mark Twain to either love or hate or love to hate or any, any variation thereof.
There were a lot of contradictions within this man. Richard Zacks, who's a great Twain biographer, wrote that he had the best and worst qualities of anyone he'd ever written about, which I think is like a good thing. He had all these terrible habits, but he was also trying really hard to be this thing. He was a humorist. He was really funny on stage, but he also wanted to be seen as this like very literary man of letters. Later in life, he got like an honorary degree from Oxford, and he was so proud of it. He wore the cap and gown to one of his daughter's weddings, which I think is so funny. I'm sure she was mortified of it, because who wouldn't be? But once again, just Twain being so charming and very much enjoying his roots, but also wanting to be this kind of posh thing and never really quite fitting in with the H.H. Rogerses. But having a foot in that world, definitely.
Yeah. So I am watching this Ask the Question thing tick up really, really fast.
Oh, yeah.
We're already at 8 questions. And so I'm going to ask you one.
Easy ones. Okay.
Hi, Katie. It just disappeared. Hold on. They move when people vote and answer things.
Of course.
Did you ever see Hal Holbrook's Mark Twain Tonight? And if so, did that inform any of your ideas about Twain's lecture performance and stand-up?
Oh, I've never seen him in person. I didn't get a chance to see him in person, unfortunately. But I've, watched a ton of them and discussed it a lot. There was a really great talk at the Mark Twain House a few months ago where a lot of scholars came to talk about Hal's legacy. And I think it's incredible what he did at being able to show new generations this performer. I think I've actually talked about this with a couple Twain scholars about, Twain told longer stories than Hal's version of Twain, but I think Hal was smart enough to know that this modern audience is probably going to want a little bit more of the aphorisms, and I think that that's a totally valid decision on his part. So yeah, it's fascinating because we definitely could have recordings of Twain's voice. That was something that was available to him. He was friends with Albert Edison. He was around this type of technology, but he was so scared on ever missing out on a payday, on someone, selling that and him not getting a fair share of it, that he never allowed his voice to be recorded. And it's a real, tragedy for history. And so I think Hal gave us the best version of that we have. There is an impression of Twain from someone who knew him that you can find online, but yeah, I'm really happy that there was someone like Hal Holbrook to come in and keep him alive, so to speak. Because, I think if it weren't for him, when I would try and explain what I was doing, people would say, oh yeah, I've seen Hal Holbrook. That's a lot of people's touchstone. And that's really important to his legacy. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right. So this one says, so I don't know if you know all of this. I have, places to send people, but it says, I was born in Hannibal and have tried to read everything written by him that was ever published. However,
Ambitious.
I found very little of his lectures. Have they been published? So I guess one of the questions for you is, where did you find information, on studying his lectures, and where did you go for your research?
Definitely. Also, I will say Hannibal, that's so cool that you're from Hannibal. I actually went there a few months ago. My mom and I took a road trip. We had a really fabulous time, exploring the museum there. And so shout out to Hannibal. That's really rad. In terms of my resources, I grabbed whatever I could. You're not going to find them published in full, but you can read his notes in preparation for the lectures. You can read his letters where he talks about them, contemporary reviews, reviews from people who saw them and are talking about them. So it is sort of, it requires a fair amount of research and piecing things together. But, the more I read, the more you crystallize an idea of what it might have been. And That's a part of being a historian. Is like you're never gonna fully know, but you're gonna have to chip away at your ignorance slowly over time.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
think it also goes back to the, he didn't want to sit there and read from a script, right? So like, probably none of his lectures were ever written out from start to finish exactly how he performed them. It's not, he didn't go ready with that. So, there's pieces and parts and accounts and all of those things, but
maybe more from his
a binder,
sure,
with the PowerPoint next to it, the what he said, and all of it, like. Exactly.
Probably, I mean, more from his younger years when he was giving lectures as a younger man. He was more likely to have like, this is my Sandwich Islands lecture, and I'm going to go around and I'm going to tell people about my travels to Hawaii. So you're more likely to be able to find those more put together. But from his later years, it's going to be a little more research driven. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite Twain lecture bit routine?
Oh, I was laughing before this. I was like, I hope people don't like ask me to do an impression of him or something. That is not my wheelhouse at all. I don't know if I have a favorite. I think
you have a favorite quote.
There's too many good ones. I think respect your superiors if you have any is a favorite of mine. I really like that. I think it's fun when he's being his full rebel self. There's a good amount of writing about when so back up a little bit. Later in his career, he was more interested in being funny, but also getting people to listen to him talk about real things. And it was this merging of the comical with the serious. People would say, he made me laugh and he made me cry. How incredible, this, polyphonic lecturer who's able to pull these different things and make them work together really seamlessly. And, I think there's a great Walter Benjamin quote about how all great works of art dissolve or invent a new form of, a new medium. And I think about that a lot, where everyone was like, wow, he was able to be funny and sad. It was incredible. But that's a long way of saying that I loved in the ways in which he was able to take some stories from Huckleberry Finn and insert them into his lectures. He would take the more dramatic pieces and either recite them in full or be able to tell those stories, tell the story of Huck lying in order to not give Jim away and have his audience crying. Livy was always encouraging him to be more serious, as you can no doubt imagine based on what you know about their relationship. But yeah, is it boring that the comedy historian says that the serious one is her favorite? Will I be kicked out of my humor studies program if I say that? Maybe.
I don't think so. I think it's a great dichotomy there. Yeah.
Yeah. And remember, this is the late 19th century, and so he's probably talking to a lot of people who have some complicated relationships to race, some like perspectives. Mm-hmm. And being able to make people think critically about their own biases and make people think critically about what they've been taught. Yeah. I think it's always a really wonderful thing. And comedians are sneaky. Comedians are really good at tricking you into thinking things.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the, you mentioned that in your paper of, they have this ability to poke at very serious topics, and if they're ever questioned, they can be like, oh, it's just a joke, or
do the Jon Stewart, like hide behind the fact that you're on a comedy show. Sure.
So it allows things to bubble to the surface in maybe a digestible way for some audiences, or
it's a lubricant
shocking way for others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, if you've just spent half an hour laughing, you're probably more likely to entertain whatever thoughts they throw at you next, Right. Yeah. He's smart. He's a smart guy.
All right, so this one got 2 votes. So it says, so do you think he was more of a writer who wrote funny, or a funny speaker who could get his puns across on paper?
Oh, fascinating. Does his name puns? That's funny. Yeah. Mark Twain, just a real pun guy. So wait, the question is, do I think he's a funny person who wrote, or?
So yeah, was he a lecturer who could write, or was he a writer who could lecture?
That's a really interesting question. It makes me think of George Carlin, actually, because in the 90s, George Carlin talked about the day that he realized, like, oh, wait, I'm a writer who performs my work as opposed to a comedian who writes his own jokes. And I think that was a really important paradigm shift in his head. So it's hard because I think if you ask Twain, he would definitely want to be the literary guy who like did lectures on the side. You know, I think that was like a bigger part of his life probably, and a bigger part of how he wanted to see himself. I think he was really frustrated that he was referred to as a humorist for so long when, like we've been saying, he wanted to be this highbrow, he wanted to be this other type of guy. So I think he was a ham. I think he was a charming guy. I think he was incredibly funny, and he was able to use that in a lot of different mediums. And so sort of a non-answer, but I think I think if anyone is both, it's our boy Mark Twain.
Yeah. I don't know if
Yeah, what's your gut say?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the lecture aspect, like you have to give so much more credit to him as an individual because, right, writing, you have editors, Livy's sitting there giving notes, you know, there's multiple drafts and those kinds of things. Well, the improv part of the lecture, I mean, that's a whole nother skill. So I agree. He was really great at both, but I don't know. We talked about this yesterday during the tech run, like, for as much as I love his writing, I really love this lecture side, and the more that I'm learning about it, and
well, it's just so dynamic.
I'm really biased.
Yeah, sure, understood. Yeah. What else we got?
Let's see. It says, thanks for being here. It says, I recall that Twain's family was very concerned that his fame as a guest speaker would cause him to be regarded only as a humorist, overshadowing his literary genius. We talked about that a little bit already, but did your research reveal how he was portrayed in the media reviews of his time?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure about the perception of him as like this binary of humorist or literary person. I know that he wanted it to be more literary than it was. You know, there's that famous quote where he said, if the audience sees you on your head, then they prefer that you stay that way, kind of thing. He was definitely scared that he wouldn't be able to be this literary person. And to his dying day, he believed that Joan of Arc was his best work, which is hilarious because no one even knows that he wrote anything about Joan of Arc. You know, apparently, I think sometimes he would say Huckleberry Finn, depending on his audience, but it's typically Joan of Arc. So he was really attached to this idea of being serious. Like we said, he loved his Oxford honorary degree. I think people saw him as really funny and really approachable and really charming. And like I said, he got a real hero's welcome when he came back from that round the world tour. He paid off his debtors in full, even though he had no like legal obligation to really do so. And yeah, people were very attached to that idea. People really loving him. You know, he was the highest paid writer, highest paid public speaker of his time. And I think it's hard to say. I think I wish he didn't feel like he had to be this fancy guy. But I think it's two sides of him, and that's why it's part of why he's just eminently appealing, because he's able to walk these really difficult lines, you know? Yeah. What do you think?
I also feel like potentially Twain, you know, obviously we have no idea, but I think he would have loved the idea of any press is good press kind of thing. So even if he was being dragged a little bit by the media, he could like spin it and like, you know, use it for his next lecture. So.
Yeah, that's a great, excellent point. Yeah.
Oh man,
you can't forget how big of a ham he was. You know,
right?
That's such a central part of the story. Yeah.
Yeah. I also imagine, like, in my mind, like, if I were to, like, you know, that question of, like, if you could have anybody, you know, at dinner or whatever like that, like, so many people choose Mark Twain. I just imagine him sitting there and, like, casually, like, throwing out things, but, like, keeping it, like, he'd, like, side-eyed you to be like, are you going to laugh at that? Are you not going to laugh at that? Like,
oh, yeah.
You know, like,
he's trying to gauge. He's trying to figure out. Yeah. I actually, it's funny that you say that. I was interviewing a stand-up comedian a few years ago, and they were telling me that they used to work in security at a department store. And he was like, yeah, that's a perfect job for a stand-up comedian because we're always like watching and sizing people up. And he'd be like, yeah, I'd look at the camera and be like, that guy's stealing. I know it. Just because they expend so much energy and have so much practice trying to read people and trying to zone in on where they're at in order to, proceed accordingly. So definitely.
Always lining people up, always watching people. Yeah. Well, and you also get, as a former security guard at a museum prior to, back in the day,
please.
it's also like, you kind of become invisible too. So you get you can watch people do things that they wouldn't normally do in front of people. And I don't know, it's just like, either it's the really tender moment, right? Somebody holds somebody's hand, or some, I've caught kids trying to lick paintings,
kids trying to lick paintings.
Yeah, like a still life of pomegranates, like
delicious.
Right? That lead paint. So good for your soul. There's so much, I don't know, fodder there for your story.
Sure. I think most writers, at least most writers that I know, very much enjoy people watching because, if you're a novelist, you care about details. You care about characterization. I have moments all the time in my life where I'm like, is this a plot of a novel? Is this a sitcom episode? Because it just fits a little bit too squarely into this like observed life situation. Right. So I definitely see him enjoying people watching. Yeah.
All right.
Are people talking about your cat in the chat? That's so cute.
Another parent. She's just like, you kicked me off your desk. I'm gonna go, sleep by the window.
Right. Small random Twain story. His daughters used to talk about how if they ever needed to go and interrupt their dad when he was up on that third floor writing, they would be sure to pick up a cat and take the cat with them when they were going to go and bother their dad so that he wouldn't get mad because he'd see the cute cat, which I just think is so charming. They had a ton of cats and he loved them. And he was always just like, oh, hi. Apparently he often wore them around his neck around the house. It's kind of, big cat guy. So I think, you two would get along.
I think so. And shameless plug here for myself. I and Erin, our education coordinator, do a YouTube series called Catching Up with the Clemenses. And our December episode that we just filmed and that I'm editing right now will be all about Mark Twain's pets. So cats everywhere.
Incredible. Tune into that. That sounds great.
Right? All right. So next question. Again, thanks for being here. How did, if at all, Richard Zacks' chasing the last laugh play into your mindset of Twain as a performer? Did his portrayal fall in line with what you expected and ultimately concluded?
Great question. Richard Zacks is a good friend of mine. I was lucky enough to get coffee or drinks with him a few times when we were both living in New York to, shoot the shit and talk about Mark Twain. So he's a really great guy. Love that book. It's, I think, one of the best books that we have that looks into Mark Twain, the performer. As mentioned, it's just about that international tour. So of course, a huge impact on my work. And also, whenever it's funny to think now because Twain is involved in the conversation more and more every year when it comes to comedy history. Wayne Federman, who I spoke with here at the Mark Twain House just a few months ago, his book is about the history of stand-up from Twain to now. So he's very much being involved in the conversation more where, when I was writing about stand-up 6 years ago, to bring up Twain as a comedian was a pretty new thought. And so every time that, Judith Yaros Lee would write about Twain from a stand-up point, I'd be like, yes, it's there, it's coming, it's more, it's happening. And so when Richard Zacks' book came out, it was very validating and very encouraging. And damn if Richard isn't just such an incredible researcher. That book is so dense, that book is so full of data. So huge shout out to him, huge impact on my perception of all of it. I probably honestly know a lot more about that time just because Richard did all the research for me. Because it's a wealth of knowledge. Highly recommend. One
of the other books that we were talking about earlier is The Comedians, right?
Yeah. I know some people are probably here because of Cliff. So big thanks to him. Cliff is a good friend and a good person. Cliff wrote a book called The Comedians, which is about the history of American stand-up. And he starts with Frank Fay. He starts in vaudeville. But he and I have talked a fair amount about what we often call proto stand-up comedy. And that's when you get back into, as we said at the beginning, your burlesque shows, your minstrel shows, and your chautauquas and your lectures, in addition to, just the vaudeville MC. But But yeah, I was so excited when that book came out and a little bit jealous that I didn't write it because I was so happy to see, oh my God, now stand-up has like a full history. We had odds and ends around, but really, really grateful for that book. Cliff's a good guy.
Awesome. I would like to note that our director, Peter Roos, is in the audience, and he would love us to know that many Mark Twain employees have cats at their homes, including some kittens and cats that were born on property. So,
whoa, that's a fun fact.
Maybe conceived on property, not necessarily born on property.
Okay, sure. But they're Twain cats. Cool. Yeah. And he had some like incredible names for his cats. I don't know how many I can rattle off the top of my head, but I think one was Beelzebub. One was named Pestilence, I'm pretty sure, which I love. Maybe this is my sign that I need to get a cat.
Yeah. One of my favorites is Bambino, and it's actually part of the public Wi-Fi password for the Twain House. So
that's very charming.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
All right.
The unofficial mascots.
Unofficial mascots. Exactly.
Definitely.
We had a pets exhibit a couple of years ago, and one of the fundraising things was you had to donate to vote for cats versus dogs, and I think people love that too. So, okay. So next question.
Yeah, sure.
Why do you suppose there was such a gap in time between Twain's global lecture circuit and the next modern day comedian to be able to tour globally?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I sometimes wonder that myself, because when you want to draw a lineage of this type of performance, there's not this like big wealth of this style of stand-up between the 1900s and the 1950s. You have your like Will Rogerses, you have the people that seem to be, carrying the torch in that sense. But yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer because it was so successful. Maybe it seemed like so singularly Twain that they were scared to try and take that on. Will Rogers was obviously able to do it in his own way, but I don't know of that many contemporaries to Will that were also doing this kind of similar style. Maybe because vaudeville houses were just so incredibly affordable and popular that a more kind of bombastic style of comedy remained popular, which is, I guess you could read that either way. It might be an indication of just how good Twain was because he was able to make this other style work when it wasn't popular at the time at all. But yeah, Mort Saul wrote, like, I'm in the tradition of Will Rogers and Mark Twain, and that's exactly what I'm doing. But, stand-up in the ways in which we think about it wasn't really a thing until the 40s and 50s. So it's a good question. Ask Cliff. I bet he knows.
We'll get him on next for Trouble Weekends.
Yeah.
All right. This one just says, please tell me more about Twain's delivery on stage. So anything you want to add? I know we've talked a little bit about his talk and his casualness, but anything else you want to add about?
Yeah, sure. We can try and paint the picture as best we can. We need someone to come in and do an impression of him. But the key things to remember are long, slow, rambly stories, which hilariously, it doesn't sound that charming, does it? Like that's a hard thing to pitch. But just so depth, and the audience just kind of laser focus on him. He would, put his hand here and stand, like an incredibly risky performance style, if you ask me. But yeah, those are the key things to remember. Slow and rambly and dedicated and often getting lost in himself. But yeah, it's sort of a fun exercise. And someone mentioned this earlier. If you listen to the audiobook of the Richard Zacks book that we've been talking about, the reader does kind of perform the clips. So that's a good way to get a sense of it.
Nice.
But I'm not a performer, so I'll just describe it for you. Unless you, Jody, want to do a little Twain impression.
No, I'm good. Thank you. I think it's interesting how you said, like, just saying it doesn't sound like it would be appealing at all, right? Like I just imagine like a professor droning on and like it being the, where you're sitting and you're just like,
right.
But he made it work. And
sure. Well, and a big part of it too is he was, we've laughed about him being a ham, but on stage he didn't really hold for laughs in the ways in which we're used to. If people we're laughing uproariously about his jokes, he would often look kind of confused or lost, like he didn't even plan it. Like he's a very sneaky guy on stage. He wants to seem like the jokes are just sort of happening, but that it wasn't necessarily something that he had a ton of agency in. They're just like, oh, is this funny? I don't even know. Who, me? You know, that's like a big part of it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we only have one more question, but before we get to it, I want to ask you, is there any other topic or any other point that you want to, that we've missed so far that you want to make sure everybody knows about when it comes to Twain and stand-up comedy?
Oh, interesting. Any last things? I think we've done a good job covering things. You know, the when I think about a stand-up and when I'm approaching writing something about stand-up, the three main arenas that I think about are, what is their delivery? How are they saying their jokes, right? What is their material? So what are they talking about? And who are they on stage? So like, what is their persona? And I think those are often the three pillars upon which a comedian can kind of build their act. And so a lot of this work was just like, okay, what's he saying? How's he saying it? And who is he? And I think that's a really good framework from which to think about stand-up. Yeah, so I'll say that. Yeah.
All right. So the last question so far, unless anybody pops one in here as we're talking these last few minutes, is your dissertation on Twain publicly available? I know you emailed me a PDF, but can anybody else read it anywhere?
I don't think it is. It might technically be property of NYU, frankly.
Right.
But
what is on JSTOR? Have you ever searched it on there?
I don't think it's on JSTOR. You can read the rest of my stuff if you go to kmears.com. You can read a lot of the stuff that I've written, or I freelance write for Vulture now and then. So if you go to Vulture and type in Katie Mears, you can see everything that I've written there as well. I wrote something about Bo Burnham a few months ago that I'm quite proud of. His new special was baffling and incredible and really hard to write about because it was so many things at one time. So, oh, what up, NYU alums? Yeah. So you can read a lot of my other stuff. Not sure about the dissertation. But if we become friends, maybe. We'll see.
Become friends with Katie if you're in. You said yesterday during the tech run that you've been reading more Twain and stuff again. Is there something that you're working on that you want to give us a little?
Me? What? No.
You can say no. It's fine, but
I mean, always in the background. In terms of plug type things, I probably don't have a ton of my own, but I would recommend you read Wayne Federman's book. I'd recommend you read Cliff Nestroff's book, Richard Zacks' books. There's a ton of good stuff out there. It's just a matter of finding it. But those three is where I would send people first, I think.
Sean says I'm going to talk about Shania Twain. So,
That's a great point. Great point. Yeah, I'm sure she would love to come and talk at the Mark Twain House.
Right? I'm sure. I wonder what her views on stand-up comedy are.
That's a great question.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Oh, we got another question. Hold on. Let me see what it is before, since we have a couple minutes left.
Yeah, sure. Just under the wire here.
Yeah. Yep. Do you think Twain's lecture would be a success with modern audiences?
It's an interesting question. I think you're more likely to find success with some of his aphorisms, with some of the short, quippy, funny things. I'm not sure that a modern audience has the attention span necessary. I think we've ruined our brains, and I don't know. I'd like to believe that he's a smart enough performer to be able to adapt to the short attention span, but as it were, I don't think so. I don't know if the laughs per minute is what a modern audience is used to. What do you think?
Well, I'm just saying they've sat with us for an hour, so at least our audience has. So maybe that.
Of course, but like a comedy club setting, that might be a bigger ask than a bunch of nerds like us.
All right, so we are right at 6:29.
This was such a blast.
And thank you, Katie, so much for doing this. This has been so much fun. I really enjoyed talking with you and emailing back and forth with you. If you do anything else with Twain, let me know, and we'll have you back for another Trouble Begins.
Oh, fabulous. What an offer. Yeah, I hope to.
Good. Good. Thank you to our fabulous audience. Really great questions, great interaction. And our next Trouble Begins will be next month. So we'll hopefully see all of you there. Thank you again, Katie, and have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you all.